how to use it. Hello everyone. Hello. Yeah, it's really annoying, isn't it? Participating. My name is Kenny Meyers. I'm on Twitter as @Meyers. I write for a little blog called Nerdery. I'm a big PHP fan. We've been doing it for a while. And I'm actually going to talk about the Laravel request cycle. Essentially, what the request cycle is whenever someone hits index.php on your site, I'm going to go through each step of the different components that it loads, how it loads those components, and tell you how it works. The one thing I won't be talking about is essentially all the code that you guys write, and all the terrible code that I write, and how it works through that system. So, and even then, there are some components that aren't fully involved in the request system. In the request cycle, for example, I'm not going to really talk about Eloquent and how that works because it's its own separate thing. And that's pretty much it. So there's essentially 4 phases of Laravel's sort of loading process, and it goes through the cycle. And it all begins with index.php. It doesn't always begin with index.php because Artisan also goes through its own sort of request cycle. But generally, I'm going to talk about how when a user visits your application, what happens. So, the first phase is the auto-loading phase. Generally, these things, the phases are divided by which files are required by PHP, with one exception. So, phase 1 begins with Laravel start constant is set, global also, if you'd like to call it that. And then index.php requires the bootstrap/autoload file. And then the bootstrap.php requires composer's vendor autoload file. And then we register Laravel's custom class loader. And then we register the workbench's autoload files. Workbench being the sort of development staging area for your own packages. And that's what phase 1 is. That's not the end of the phase 1 presentation, but it starts with this. So Laravel start is this just micro time. It's the float, it's the number of seconds in Unix time. And it's really great for really quick benchmarking on very specific things. It's not going to take into account things like issues you run into with Apache or your PHP FPM, CGI process, like totally going bonkers, all the server stuff. But it is a really good way to get a quick benchmark of how your code is executing. Because at any time during the requests, during any of your code, you can actually call that constant, and do that function essentially, do microtime true, and get the number of seconds between the initiation of index.php and wherever you want in your code base. It's very nice. It's very friendly. So the second thing that happens is index.php requires bootstrap /autoload.php. The autoload file requires composer's autoload. And I'm not actually going to talk about composer, but this guy is. And based on that picture, Phil, it's legal in Seattle now. Just saying. But Composer essentially does what the next thing does, which is SPL autoload register is PHP's terribly, terribly named class autoloader function. It's used everywhere whenever you need to get a class going. It's used in Composer, it's used in the 2 tools I'm going to talk about next. It's used in the container, it's used in a bunch of places, not in the container specifically, but it's used for like aliases, classes. And essentially what it does is it allows you to pass a callback or a callable. In many cases it could be an array with a class name and then a method to call, usually a static method, or it can actually just be a function at this point. And it's a queue. There are a couple words that I always mispronounce because of childhood tragedy. One of them is Q, which I always pronounce quay occasionally, so if I do that, sorry. I'll point out the other ones as they come up, but if I say that, just laugh and point and make me feel sad. So the first thing Laravel does after it loads all the Composer packages is it goes and it registers its own loader. So this is how that looks. The register method, I sort of pared it down a little bit, but you can see it registers essentially itself and the method load, which is a static method, and then it goes through, and it's just very simple. It goes through directories and it just finds the specific pieces of code that you're using. This is generally used for things like your controllers, your models, stuff that isn't necessarily package specific, but is sort of app specific, and in many other contexts. And then finally, oh, by the way, in the bottom corner, you can kind of see the context of where we are in the code base. So if you ever like, where the hell are you right now, which will probably happen several times during this, you can seek solace in the bottom right corner. But the third part is the workbench, and the workbench is a staging area, a place for you to work on your PHP composer packages that work with Laravel without necessarily committing to packages and putting them in the vendor directory. So obviously we need to be able to get those files. And the way that we do that is we use the start function, the starter class. And there's sort of two pieces that I actually want to talk about here, and that's the Symfony Finder and the file system. So the Finder class is Symfony based. I'm generally not going to touch too much on all the Symfony stuff, that's huge. But this one's really cool. It implements countable and iterator aggregate. These are two implementations that essentially allow you as a developer to use the count method with an object and see how many, for example, file objects that the current Finder object has. Iterator aggregate lets you do the for loop on said object, and I'll show you an example of how that works later. Well, shortly. And then it traverses a given directory and returns an array of objects, an array, see? That's another one. With some lovely like file metadata, essentially just an object that can give you specific things in a class. So this is the Finder. I really actually like the syntax of it. We're past the path, and in this case it's actually the workbench path, if you remember from the previous lovely slide. And it looks for files named autoload.php, which is generated by Composer, which you will find out all about in the next presentation. It gets all those files and it stores them in this autoloads variable. And then I want to talk about this file system because it comes up quite a couple times in the request cycle. And essentially, it's just sort of a class wrapper for common operations. In particular, you can see right down here, or right down there, or right down there, that it requires once just a file, and it's just a wrapper over that method. Obviously, there's other methods in that class that can do a little more advanced things and eventually maybe do some prep work before doing the required ones. But it's a nice little piece of code that you can use. And so you can see that auto loads, he runs through the things, he iterates through the file because of that iterator aggregate, and he requires once each of those composer auto loads. And that's essentially how the workbench goes. So that's actually the end of the first phase. It's pretty much straight just loading pieces of code. So at the end of this, you should understand that you have your Laravel start benchmark, and then you have your auto loading queue, which starts with the composer packages, then moves on to Laravel's custom loader, which then loads like your controller classes, and then beyond that, at the very bottom, you have your workbench stuff. So you can understand, you shouldn't have collisions because you should be using namespaces like a mature PHP programmer, but if it does happen, you can find out where it goes. So that's phase one. Phase two is application phase. We return to index.php, and phase two commences. First, we require Bootstrap start PHP. We create a new instance of Illuminate Foundation application. This creates the request object and registers 3 service providers. We'll get into what these things are. We detect and set the environment. We bind our application file paths to the application object. And then we require the foundation start PHP file via application gets bootstrap file. And that sort of begins the next phase. So, first, we require bootstrap start. and then instantiation. Our application object has been created. Actually, ready? Oh yeah, it has begun! And this is really kind of the core of where Laravel begins, and it's great. That picture is actually great. I want to talk first, though, about this application object. The Illuminate Foundation application object extends this container object. And this is one of the core pieces of the Laravel framework, is understanding this container. How many people, I promise I won't make fun of you, really have a hard time grasping the inversion of control of a container object like that? So you guys are idiots. I struggle with it intensely, and I've spent a lot of time obviously preparing for this presentation and learning about it. But the core of sort of Laravel's IOC is this container object. And I'm going to tell you why. There are 4 methods you need to know. There's container share, container instance, container bind, and container make. A good way to think of this is container share creates an object that an application can share between everyone. It's sort of the singleton method. Container instance is more like creating a property. So sort of like setting a string to be a certain value in an array using a key. That's generally how that's created. And then container bind sort of takes a callable function. It's where a lot of the, as you saw in the previous presentation, you use bind to essentially do a lot of the dependency injection, among other things. And then container make is the magical thing that gets called that knows what to execute, knows where to put things, and knows what to give you. And there's a lot going on there. So first, container share. You can see the key thing is the static object. That sort of makes sure that there's no other object instantiated like this object. It is unique. And then returns said object to the application object. The next one is instance, which abstract is kind of a funny term. I would think of it more as like a name or a title for what exactly you're storing. And that, again, just kind of goes through and sets like the property. So you can see it right there that the instances property has this essentially name equals instance check. I'm trying to think of a good example of what that. We'll see it later with the paths, which are the application paths, which are just hard-coded strings, which are just strings for where different folders in the application are. Yeah. Anyway. And then bind, which is a little more complex. And all of these tend to deal with, most of the time, callables, with, of course, the exception of instance, because container make handles the processing, the calling of things, or sending them to be called, and registering these things for the container object. So that is possible because of the way Laravel accesses its properties, or its essentially state. It's the objects involved. And that has to do with because it implements this array access interface, which essentially lets you access a PHP object like an array. Kind of looks like that. So what this is doing is creating this new instantiation of application, and obviously freedom's only available in America, being that we're in DC. And when this gets assigned, when it says app equals freedom, what it's actually doing is going to the container object through the inheritance change and calling offset set. It works a lot like magic methods do, but they're not technically magic methods. And so when you retrieve something, it calls offset get. And generally, when you're retrieving something from the container object, it's going to call this made function. And that's kind of how the container works, and that's how it sort of hides things, like calling a function, calling a method. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm ignoring you guys. You guys look great. Not you. So that's kind of the end of the container object itself. But the container object, of course, is the parent class of the application object. So let's kind of look at the construct method of that. The first thing is you can see instantly that array access kicks right in the construct method, which essentially calls the offset set, and it creates the request from globals. This is a Laravel request object, which sort of does some nice things with the Symfony request object, which is sort of the basis of this whole thing. Which, just like a lot of things that you've used before, a lot of frameworks and stuff does, takes a lot of the variables set by PHP in the server, pulls them down, and turns them into a really nicely accessible object. The next thing it does is it registers these exception service provider, routing service provider, and event service provider. What this does is, this is application register. Service providers are essentially the evolution of bundles. When a service provider is created, when you put it, there's a configuration option where you can create these service providers and essentially tell Laravel, I've created this service provider, and through the request cycle, it will call this register method. Laravel has 3 that it instantiates pretty much right away through various means, and that is the exception, the error handler, and the router. And this is what it does when it registers those things. You can see it calls provider registers, so it calls the register class on each of those service providers that you create. And then it sets them to the service provider's local property, and it sets the loaded providers to true. That comes into play in a couple of things, not quite yet. Here's an example of the exception service provider register method. Register kernel handlers just registers a bunch of stuff that I didn't really want to go into. And then this app exception, again, using that array access method, because service providers either have the app accessible as a property, uses the share, which, as we know, was the singleton. As we all learned earlier, was the singleton part, and registers and does all this stuff. And it's a way that you can write your own thing. You can create your own register methods and create your own service providers, and then use this sort of built-in API of sorts to get in later in the request, which I'll show you. Now we go back to the start.php file. We're back in the Bootstrap. We've got our new app object, and we detect the environment. That's fairly straightforward. It uses a couple of libraries to detect whether it's your machine. For example, it's my machine. Please don't start hacking it while I talk to you about it. That's my machine, and it's set to the local, and it uses the env variable throughout the request cycle to do a couple things. But again, it's just checking, the headers and the local data to see what it is, and sets the environment to whatever you've set. One of the cooler things about this actually is you can name an environment and give it a callable, and it will automatically just override what you're the whole process of trying to detect the environment. You can write your own configuration stuff. It's a really cool little feature that I found while digging in there. Yeah. So the next thing after that, sequentially, is it binds the install paths. This is, again, nothing really too complex. It uses that instance method that we saw in the container, essentially creating these properties that are strings. Pretty straightforward. And it does so by getting the paths.php files, which is in the base sort of Laravel Bootstrap folder, I believe. So at the end of that phase, it gets the Bootstrap file via the application itself. The reason it does it via a method call versus like a file system, for example, is because all the Laravel stuff is via Composer, via packages. So it's a really nice convenience way to wrap actually returning the require path without having to do any hard coding. of things as far as front is concerned. So yeah, the bootstrap, I'm clapping a lot too, like a monkey. Slowly, when you give talks, you start becoming incredibly self-conscious as the room is more and more quiet and you start self-analyzing. It's weird. So anyway, the bootstrap file keeps things clean. And phase 2 is complete. Let's all applaud for phase 2 being complete. All right, I'll only make you participate like 1 or 2 more times. And that's the extent of it. So we required the bootstrap start PHP file. This is after auto-loading all that stuff. We created a new instance of Illuminate Foundation application. This creates our request object, which will be assigned to the application itself via the container stuff. And we've also registered 3 service providers right off the bat. We check to set the environment. We bind our file paths to our application object, and then we require the foundation start PHP file via a method in the application object. And that moves us to phase 3, bootstrapped. Bootstrapped is probably when the core of a lot of the logic gets done. And it starts with this file, which sits in the Illuminate Foundation folder in the package itself. And so we set the environment variable if we're running tests. I did not investigate what happens here at all because I didn't do any sort of test stuff, so I can't give you more insight on that. It sets up the facade, which is another word which I pronounce facade sometimes. Very phonetic. It loads the config files. It sets the default time zone. It registers the alias, which I call alias, and allows for put and delete requests with forms. It creates the provider repository. It boots service providers with application boot. And I'll talk about that, of course. And then it requires all the sort of user configurable stuff where you can do things like bind objects and inject dependencies and go crazy. So this is how it checks if there's this unit testing variable set, and if it does, it changes the environment to be the test environment. Again, I have no clue really what's happening here. Just know that that's what happens if you're unit testing. So first we have to turn off error handling and report all errors. And that's how we do it. This is pretty straightforward. Error reporting is set to all so that our service providers, which registered our objects, can handle the exceptions and errors and everything that comes from the problems that you all create, but I don't because I write perfect code. And then display errors off is set. And then we need to lie to people about the class names that they're using. So we set up the facade, and we set the facade application to have our current app variable as it's a static property, so it carries along throughout the class, and that's where it gets set up. And now we have to load config files. The way that we do that is through the bind if. If you recall, bind earlier did some magic, but bind if essentially checks for the existence of something, and if not, it doesn't do anything. It's just a conditional version of bind. It returns a new file loader, and as the file system object we talked about earlier is there, and it takes a path. So it loads the configuration path, and there you can see our app path, which we set with those file paths earlier being brought in. This whole scheme with the configuration object, which I'll show you in a second, is one of the more complex. It feels like one of those areas where you can make an argument against sort of object purity and dependency injection, because there's such a huge jump everywhere in the inheritance chain and how many objects it loads to parse the config files. I'm not going to go into full detail, but I'd be happy to talk about it afterwards to some of you. Or maybe Taylor wants to ask why I just said that about his code. But we can't really start loading files without starting our exception handling, so the application does that. It initiates the start exception handling, which interacts with that exception service provider that we did, the object that we passed back to handle exceptions to our application is now initiated. And then we load the actual application config. I know many of you obviously have used Laravel, and the way that it loads the application config is you can create directories in your config that are specific to the environment. It checks that, it loads the generic config first, then it loads the environment configuration. It attaches the app instance of config. You can see there, and if you recall, instance was what we used to assign sort of a generic, easily accessible thing, like a string, or in this case, it's an array. And then we assign that locally, the app config app, to our config object. This config is actually a repository object, and repository object actually implements the array accessor method. So this is actually doing two calls to offset get in each of those different objects, and it knows how to pull in things like your environment and which config it wants to use. So now we have our configuration. So we set our time zone to the configuration time zone, the one that's set in our config/app.php. And then we registered the alias loader. With the aliases, we have in our config/app.php, it's an array, and it's what we use essentially to do things like app bind, the app bind method. It's what hides the implementation of few states, I believe is the word. I would totally be wrong on that. The next thing we do in our request is enable the HTTP method parameter override. This is something that I've had handy in most everything I've ever worked in. I've never investigated the actual cause of this, but essentially a lot of web browsers have trouble sending put and delete, I believe, to with the correct headers, with a form request. Essentially, this sort of fakes it via a Symfony component so that you can actually do that. All right. So we need to store all our service providers, obviously. It's obviously the next step, right, guys? And we do that, there's the config option manifest. Again, anything you can config locally is just config/app.php or config/environment/app.php. We create this new provider repository, which uses, again, the file system, and then takes the path and creates this sort of this is a manifest, for example. It creates this file in storage/meta, I believe. There it is, it's right in the damn slide. And JSON that sits in app/storage/meta. And it's essentially a quick way to access these particular classes to register. These are service providers, and service providers, again, are sort of evolution bundles. They're a way for you to interact with the application at many different levels. So the next thing to do then is to go through this repository and boot everything that has a boot method. In service providers, you can add a method called boot, which will then do whatever you need it to do on boot. There's not a lot of restrictions to it, but the application object itself, at this point in the request cycle, will go through and run those methods through each of the service providers using that service provider repository. And that's a good example. That's the auth service provider boot. It just registers the auth events. It can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. That's the beauty of it. And then it'll also fire any registered callbacks. And then it'll start requiring all these files. Again, where you set things like your bindings that you want, dependency injections. It starts with the global.php file, which actually implements some of the class loader, which implements the class loader from earlier to load like the models, the controllers, and such. And it'll do the same for the environment file. One thing in the auto load register queue is when you actually do the load alias register alias loader. It puts those classes that it's sending to the top of the queue. So now at this point, it's actually loading those alias classes, and then the composer objects, composer libraries. Then the what was the next one, guys? Really? The composer objects, Laravel's custom loader. Thank you. And then beyond that, the workbench stuff. So that's kind of where it is at this point. And then finally, we'll get the routes.php file. That is the most, that's where all the action happens, pretty much in this start.php file. And the routes file, I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with. So, we set the environment variable for running tests. We set up the facade. We load the config file. We set the default time zone. We register the alias loader. We allow for put and delete requests with forms. We create the provider repository. We boot service providers with application boot. And then we require all these files that help us customize our application. We return to bootstrap/start.php, which returns our hatch object to index.php. Really? That's index.php. Seems like two things. One, you're almost done listening to all this. And two, you know where that file is. There's nothing confusing about it. So part 4 is actually the most basic part of the cycle. It uses a lot of built-in Symfony stuff. It's very elegant, and it's going to be the least painful of all the 4 phases. It runs the app. It sets the session store if it exists. It finds the route. It runs the route code, calling filters where applicable. It generates a response object. It sends the response, and it calls the after filter. So, app run. That's the end of index.php. Here's the run method. Essentially what it does is it calls this dispatch. And then the dispatch calls the router dispatch, which we set up earlier. It first checks if the session store exists, if we've created it, if we have a session store, and then passes it to the request, and then dispatches that request to the router. It finds the route and runs it. There are all sorts of checks involved with it that I have spared you from, but essentially it just makes sure that the route exists, it doesn't, return that kind of stuff. And then it runs the route. You can see that this is the router class at the bottom. And that the route that it actually runs is actually an object that there's a route class. So there's the router and the route. Router asks the route class to run, and then it returns that data, and then the router will then generate a Symfony response object and send the response to the browser. We're already back in application. And then finally, it'll call the global filter finish. And it will, this is, again, after the response is sent, so all the stuff is sent to the browser. And that's it. I mean, phase 4 is the easy part of it. So again, it'll run the app. It'll set the session store if it exists. It finds the route. It then runs the route code, calling filters where applicable. It generates a response object. It sends the response, and then it calls the global after filter. It also calls the global before filter before it finds the route itself. So make sure that that's not wasted time. And that's it. That is essentially the request cycle. Any questions?
beginning of the talk, you talked about Laravel at start. This is a lot of business versus index.html. Do you have any idea what time it is for the various stages? Did you take a look at that? See if you're actually moving on applications?
Actual benchmarks of when certain pieces hit?
Yeah, just sort of curiosity.
I have no idea. I mean, all very quickly. Obviously, it loads very quickly because it doesn't load everything up front, essentially, that we all need. My general feeling that was just because of the nature of how dependency injection is handled and how the app container essentially does that is that it does a really excellent job of making sure that nothing is called unless it definitely needs it, desperately. So, and the SPL auto load register handles that decent too. So, unfortunately, I don't have benchmarks. Damn, I just want to about benchmarks.
Normal flow runs probably about 150 milliseconds or so. Just double check.
He said a normal hello world is probably about 150 milliseconds. Yes?
Well done. How long did that take you to put together?
Oh God, days. In fact, I embarrassed because I was making sure I had triple checked everything because I'm sure there were some things I was off a little bit about because I just didn't want to come across like too much of an idiot. I'm okay with 5% idiot. So I spent about 3 days like triple checking, going through code routes. It was fun actually. I have no life. I cry a lot.
Where did you get that quote from me?
Oh, the derp? Oh, just from your Twitter feed. Yeah.
Is there anything in the bootstrap that you think should be done differently?
In the request site, nothing. This is Laracon, everything is perfect. It's the one instance I had. The one thing that I really was like, this is rough, was going through how the config files are loaded. It jumps around a lot between different methods, and it's like load loader, this loader load, and it calls all these things in this really sort of complex sequence. And that's just the nature of creating a system. That's the problem is creating all these objects, of creating a system that's so like pure, like Laravel's trying to be. It tends to just create sometimes these sort of object massacres where it just jumps from object to object and on a like architectural level, like really nicely designed for what they're required for, but sometimes it makes it hard to read what's going on. Yes, young man in the back.
I would say this. Quickly about the config loader thing, just kind of the thought process behind that, because it does seem a little complex at first, is like we've had a couple situations where say you're writing like a CMS and you want to have all your config like in the database or like in some other store and have like a graphical manager for all your config, then you can actually like override that config loader, the file version with like a database config loader. And that was actually like strictly for GreatMaker, I think. But basically, that gives you the flexibility to get away from the file config. Like if you wanted to combine all configs into one file, like for performance reasons, that's why you can. That's why it's bound in the container to allow you to override that. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's another thing I don't have. I haven't built an awesome framework, so I don't have that kind of knowledge. So, mine comes at a more academic level. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you, guys.